Well, here we go then with natural moral law theory. Now, let's begin with the definition of natural moral law. It's always best to begin any essay that you write with a definition, and this one's as good as any. Natural moral law theory states that morally good behaviour is natural for human beings as an expression of the kinds of beings they are. It's very easy, unless you give a definition at the beginning, to go through an entire essay without really having said what the theory you're discussing is. So it's always best to get it in there fairly succinctly at the beginning. Note it's not the other way around. Not everything that's natural is moral. Blowing one's nose and going to sleep are natural, but they're morally neutral. Note also there might be a number of different reasons why philosophers believe moral behaviour is natural. Perhaps because God created humans in his own image. Perhaps because reason pervades the universe and goodness is thought to be reasonable. Perhaps because Darwinian evolution has selected for empathy over selfishness. Natural law theory isn't necessarily theistic. Now, these are the three historical phases, as I've sort of defined them really, of natural moral law theory in Western thought. The first is ancient natural law theory. Then you got Thomas Aquinas' natural law theory. And finally, you got Hugo Grotius' natural law theory. Now, the ancient one divides into three, I think. Direct commands from God, for example, the Bible. Aristotle, and we'll look at Aristotle in a moment. And also Hellenistic, that's Roman, Greek Roman thinking, for example, Cicero and the Stoics. The A-level wants you to focus primarily on Thomas Aquinas' natural law theory. Aquinas' natural law theory is a Christian development of Aristotle's, so we have to begin with Aristotle. Now let's have a look at his Nicomachean Ethics. That's his big book on how to behave. Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE, was an ancient Greek and usually regarded as one of the founders of Western philosophy. He studied under Plato until Plato's death in 347. Aristotle was, amongst other things, a biologist, and he believed that there's a roughly stable notion of justice biologically built into a person as a function of what he or she is. This justice is independent of the justice reigning in particular societies in which human beings may happen to find themselves. The telos, Greek for purpose, of a human being is to achieve eudaimonia, happiness or excellence, and natural law constrains behaviour in a way which helps us to do that. Aristotle's book, The Nicomachean Ethics, explains how to achieve eudaimonia. One does it through cultivating virtues such as, for example, generosity, courage, and prudence. For Aristotle, one can only do it within a polis, a community. As a member of that community, human beings are political animals. Now then, this is where we go from Aristotle to Thomas Aquinas, a 1,500 years later. What interests Aristotle is what sort of virtues or positive character traits a person should cultivate in order to reach his or her telos or purpose. Attaining eudaimonia is a matter of trying to develop in oneself those virtues, things like wisdom, prudence, courage, liberality, and craftsmanship. Christianity can also be understood as trying to encourage certain character traits, things like kindness, forgiveness, humility, piety, and sincerity. So Aristotle's philosophy provides a good structural basis on which to build a Christian version of natural law, which is where Thomas Aquinas comes in. Now, let's have a look at Thomas Aquinas' theory in detail, beginning with the telos, or the telos, the purpose of human beings, because that differs from Aristotle. Thomas Aquinas, 1224 to 1274, agreed with Aristotle that the telos of human beings is eudaimonia. However, he disagreed about what constitutes it. For Aquinas, we all share a common human nature because God has created human beings for the purpose of enjoying fellowship with him. The full vision of God, which is only available in the next life, is every human being's purpose. God will help human beings reach their telos through his grace, loving mercy, although by creating in his own image, he's already given us a start. as a result of Adam and Eve's disobedience, as described in the book of Genesis, we're sinful beings. Sin for Aquinas involves a departure from natural law, so that we let God down by performing less than he reasonably has the right to expect. Sin is based on ignorance. If we knew fully what God wanted and how important it was to us and him that we should provide it, we would never sin. But God can enable us to overcome sin. Now, these are the 4 tiers of law in the universe. You really need to know these by heart. First one is eternal law, which is God's will, the principles by which God made and controls the universe. In some ways, that's rather like the laws of science. And the whole universe is governed by the laws of nature, and that's eternal law. Secondly is divine law, which is laws it's enshrined in Scripture, the Bible in other words, particularly in the 10 Commandments and the Sermon on the Mount. Thirdly is the one we're looking at, so this puts it in a bit of context. Natural law, the moral law of God within human nature that's discoverable through the use of reason. It remains always and everywhere the same. And finally, human law, which is the laws human beings themselves make. Human law is sometimes called positive law, and Aquinas indicates that while it may change from place to place, from era to era, it's the law of nations. So sometimes human law may be severely at odds, I suppose, with natural law. Hopefully, the ideal is to get both of them working in harmony, but not all rulers will want to do that, obviously. And here we've got the use of reason. Reason plays a big part in Aquinas' thinking, and it helps us reach our telos. For Aquinas, God made humans to be reasonable, and to be good is to be reasonable. Some people think Aquinas' view represents a new departure in natural law theory. Ancient natural law theory had made natural law directly dependent on God or the gods. But Aquinas makes it dependent on reason, which is dependent on God. In other words, he makes natural law only indirectly dependent on God. That's quite important. Whatever is contrary to the order of reason is contrary to the nature of human beings as such, says Aquinas, and what is reasonable is in accordance with human nature as such. By the use of reason, Aquinas thought we could discover 4 cardinal or natural virtues. Aristotle had previously suggested the same thing, and agreed in advance, like 1,500 years beforehand, on the virtues, which were 1, fortitude, the strength of mind that enables a person to successfully deal with hardship; 2, justice, morally right behaviour; 3, temperance, moderation in thought, behaviour, and action; and 4, prudence, practical wisdom, sensible caution. And these are the 3 revealed virtues. The use of reason, we can't really discover these by reason. They're revealed in Scripture. The 4 cardinal virtues were what human beings possess by nature. We saw those in the last slide. Such virtues would mean that human beings would naturally obey the 9 of the 10 Commandments. For example, do no work on the Sabbath was the odd one out. You can't work that out through reason. To the 4 natural virtues St. Paul had in the Bible added 3 revealed virtues. Virtues the existence of which had been revealed by God to humans and which were not discoverable by contemplation: faith, hope, and charity. Aquinas disagreed with St. Augustine, 354 to 430, who was probably the greatest teacher in the church before Aquinas, that human beings have been so corrupted by Adam and Eve's disobedience that it's no longer possible for us to know what is good. That's what Augustine thought. Aquinas thought this was far too pessimistic. All humans want the good, which is God, even though they may not necessarily believe in or even know about God. Natural law enables everyone to live a virtuous life, only providing they use their reason correctly. There were wrong uses of reason, such as calculating how to rob a bank. And here's a few miscellaneous facts. Our ultimate purpose, telos, is blessed supernatural union with God in the next life. But there are subordinate purposes, teloi, which tend to the realization of this, which are reproduction, the maintenance of a just and ordered society, learning, and Christian worship. None of these is an end in itself, but you can understand that it'd be quite difficult to live the Christian life in a society in which really none of those actually exist. So your subordinate purpose is to help provide those. Motives, interior acts, are more important to Aquinas than consequences, exterior acts, in deciding whether a good action has been performed. We should not take this to extremes. A good motive cannot excuse a truly disastrous set of consequences. In general, Aquinas agreed with Aristotle that virtuous acts lead to other virtuous acts because we get into the habit of performing them. To live a truly good life, we need to consciously train ourselves to perform good and avoid bad actions. After a while, good actions will come naturally, which, given that this is natural law theory, is what they always were underneath anyway. For Aquinas, therefore, it's arguably a question of retraining ourselves. Now then, here we've got the key precept and the primary and secondary precepts. These are crucial. So they're a crucial set of precepts that really one has to understand. The first one is quite straightforward. Do good and avoid evil. That's the one key precept. But that can be unpacked to generate 5 primary precepts. Aquinas didn't call them that, by the way, but that's what they tend to be called in textbooks nowadays, and it's worth calling them that in the exam. The preservation of life, ordering of society, worship of God, education of children, and reproduction, from which a large number of secondary precepts can be deduced. Probably too large to list here. But to give an example, from the primary precept obliging us to reproduce, plus the key precept to love our neighbour, Aquinas thought the secondary precept to only have one spouse could be deduced. You might disagree. Fair enough. The fact is, the nature of deduction in areas like this is always a difficult business. So secondary precepts do usually require a degree of genuine discussion. Aquinas accepts this. Let's have a look at the doctrine of double effect, which is also very important. And it's quite important, this, for things like euthanasia and even abortion. But we'll look at those separately maybe later. Another area in which discussion of Aquinas' theory of morality invites discussion is his use of the doctrine of double effect. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the doctrine or principle of double effect is often invoked to explain the permissibility of an action that causes a serious harm, such as the death of a human being, as a side effect of promoting some good end. According to the principle of double effect, sometimes it's permissible to cause a harm as a side effect or double effect of bringing about a good result, even though it would not be permissible to cause such a harm as a means of bringing about the same good end. Whereas St. Augustine thought it was unjustifiable to kill a person, even in a kill or be killed situation of self-defense, Aquinas argues that such a self-defense scenario is an acceptable reason for killing, providing one doesn't intend the killing. Why? Because there's a primary precept to the effect that a person must act to preserve life, and one act may have 2 effects. In achieving the first effect, an unintended second effect may be unavoidable. Now let's have a look at some criticisms of Aquinas. As preliminary, in a sense, we'll look at the criticisms of natural law in more detail later at the end. One criticism that's always been levelled at Aquinas is that his approach was not holistic enough. For example, instead of considering the purpose of the whole person throughout his discussion, he asks, what is the purpose of human genitalia? As if human genitalia could be separated from the person. It's a consequence of the answer he gives, reproduction, that secondary precepts to abstain from homosexuality and masturbation result. Remember, the secondary precepts are such as will admit of a degree of discussion. So one isn't necessarily constrained by natural law at all to disapprove of those 2 things. Another problem is who decides what the purpose of human organs is in the first place. Very different sets of secondary precepts can result from different notions of purpose here. Now then, this is post-Aquinas natural law. It's modern natural law, in a sense, Grotian natural law theory. The modern history of natural law theory began with Hugo Grotius, 1583 to 1645, a lawyer, poet, and theologian, although a believer in God, said that natural law requirements would be valid even if God did not exist. Grotius has come to be known as the father of modern natural law because in his major work, On the Law of War and Peace, 1625, he began to translate natural law into a theory of human rights. Natural law theory becomes a theory of rights when it says each individual is naturally morally valuable. The natural moral value of each person means that they must be treated in such and such a way if that natural moral value is to be recognized and affirmed. Thus, they should be protected against things like death and homelessness and interference with their free expression. These protections become rights. But for that reason, natural law theory is still incredibly relevant today, and most people believe that others have rights and that they themselves have rights. And they very rarely ask where they come from, but their ultimate basis is natural law. The problem with secular theories of rights is the problem of A, where they come from, and what is their basis, and B, why I should not just disregard others' rights when it's advantageous for me to do so. Aquinas, of course, had an answer to both these questions. A, God created humans as morally valuable, and B, because God will punish you. And let's have a look at the weaknesses, the genuine weaknesses, possibly, of natural law theory. Now, these are something you're probably going to use in your AO2 evaluation, and it's worth noting that you also need counter arguments. So if you're going to use these, don't just say, well, these are the weaknesses, because just listing them as weaknesses isn't really going to get you very far. If you just present them as weaknesses, that's AL1. It's just an explanation of the meaning of the theory in some ways. Yes, the theory is this, but it has some weaknesses. What you need to do to get the marks in the evaluation part of the paper is to use them as parts of an argument. So it's a very good idea to begin any essay you do with, I'm going to argue this, about whatever it is the title of the essay is. But let's have a look at those weaknesses. In the absence of God, how do we know what's natural? Anything could be natural insofar as humans are products of nature. Is New York natural? Are mobile phones? To what extent should we identify natural with good? Disease, famine, hurricanes, volcanoes, etc. are all natural. Paracetamol, aspirin, and radiology are all artificial. It overlaps a little bit with the problem of evil, that. If natural law is about humans achieving a specifically human purpose, it may be that there's no such thing. Existentialists like French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, 1905 to 1980, and the Algerian novelist Albert Camus, 1913 to 60, were sure that there was no common purpose for all human beings. Humans were free to construct their own purposes, and to pretend otherwise was bad faith. Even if humans are naturally disposed to be good, does that mean that they ought to be good? Put it this way, if they were naturally disposed to be selfish, would that mean they ought to be selfish? It's a more complicated question than it might seem. Maybe it would. I mean, sometimes you do hear people say, well, if you're far too altruistic, you do need to be a little bit more selfish. Give yourself a little bit more me time. Stop thinking so much about others. Maybe there's a sense there that we are partly, at least, naturally selfish, and in order to fulfill our own natures, we need to, accept that and try to serve it somehow. And finally, modern psychological theory sits uneasily with the notion that humans can find a natural law of cardinal virtues in their hearts. To give one example, the theory of Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, sees humans as motivated by a set of primal desires which are basically amoral. So there we go. Those are the weaknesses, and that's really the end. So that's natural law theory. Thank you very much for watching.